turn them on.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm always happy to help resolve the technical issues, but I did want to clarify for the record that I'm sitting at the table as a representative of the New England Fisheries Management Commission Council. I will only be voting on the Jonah crab-related issues and abstaining on all the other actions brought forth by the board.
Thank you, Terry. I want to add as well under number 9, other business. Megan is going to give a short presentation on the outcome of the state-federal meeting concerning the Lobster Observer Program that was held in early October up in our Gloucester office. All right, moving on to agenda item number 4, discuss the management response to the 2015 American Lobster Stock Assessment. I think you folks are well aware from the last presentation, the status of the stock was considered quite robust everywhere except southern New England, and this board and the commission does face a conundrum of how to deal with this particular component of the lobster population in this changing environmental situation. Did you have any slides you wanted to show on that?
We'll start with them.
Okay, so the for those of you, yes. I did not, because I was informed that there wasn't any request for public comment. Thank you, Joe. So at the request of this board, a subcommittee was convened on October 2nd, hosted by David Simpson in Connecticut, and we brought together the heads of the LCMTs, some of the leading state agency officials, and the technical committee members, and discussed in depth over about 7 or 8 hours the conundrum, the challenges that we all have in southern New England. And we were tasked with try to come up with objectives, management objectives for taking on the dire condition of the stock. And it was a very challenging meeting, very challenging discussion. It fell along somewhat predictable lines in terms of the industry's concerns about impacts of conservation measures on their business plans. The technical committee presented a number of projections suggesting that under a whole array of natural mortality levels, the stock is unlikely to recover, certainly to the historic levels that the current plan requires in terms of targets and thresholds, but even to arrest the decline of this stock may take some pretty dramatic action, some pretty dramatic conservation. And so the group really struggled with trying to come up with various objectives, and everyone in the room certainly agreed that doing nothing is certainly inappropriate, but at the same time the moratorium option or something close to a moratorium is extremely difficult, and certainly no one in the room had an interest to do that as well. So there are a number of possible objectives, competing objectives in the document on pages 2 and 3, and they include rebuilding the southern New England stock, which we all agreed couldn't be done to historic levels, prevent further declines in spawning stock biomass, which could have a devastating effect on the economics of the fishery, which is, for many of the guys, pretty marginal. Another objective would be to slow the rate of decline in the spawning stock biomass, as well as preventing the loss of fishery infrastructure. And so I'd like to have some discussion with you all this morning about what we as a group should lay out as objectives for this area, because I think we are in a very unique situation. Everybody talks about climate change and ocean warming, and I think in some ways this is really the poster child for the effects of the environment on these fish stocks. The press has picked up on a lot of other environmental fishery stories like cod in the Gulf of Maine, but we laid the groundwork for this argument about 6 or 7 years ago with some of the work that the folks in Rhode Island and Massachusetts did, and described the mechanism for which this stock seemed to be failing in terms of reproductive potential and the loss of optimal habitat because of warming waters. And so I'd like to open up the discussion around the room, especially to those who participated in the meeting, and get your thoughts on how we should move forward. Bob?
Just real quickly before the board jumps into the meat of that conversation, I just want to introduce three people that are at the table. They're generally familiar faces to the commission, but they are new to the Lobster Board or back to the Lobster Board. Senator Brian Langley from Maine is here. He's back. He was a commissioner before. Now he's back as a commissioner. We've got Ed O'Brien from Maryland down at the end. Ed is familiar to a lot of you that have been with the commission working on striped bass. He's been on the advisory panel for a long time. And then we've got a gentleman named Pat Augustine that's back at the table once more from New York. So.
Thanks, Bob. And I'd like to add Renee Cloutier is here from the Maine Marine Patrol representing the Law Enforcement Committee as well. He's at my left. I'm looking for my colleagues from Southern New England to start the discussion. David?
Sure, thanks. I wish I had the answer, and then we could, just kind of go toward that. But I think the central question we've been struggling with for quite some time now is understanding that, in all likelihood, it's warming waters that we've experienced since about 1998. That is at the heart of the change in prospects for lobster. Do we subscribe to a climate change theory that says it's bad and it's going to get worse, so it's a hopeless cause for lobster? Let the fishery just go ahead and catch the last one, and when it's over, hopefully something will replace it. Or do we look at it and say, yes, it's a much more stressful environment that they're in, but there remains some productivity in this stock, and maybe we can't achieve the level of productivity and harvest that we once enjoyed, but is there a new lower level of productivity that could be sustainably managed and harvested? And I think that's the central question, and I haven't decided myself. I think it comes down to whether you're just a pessimist or believe that there might be something worth holding on to. And then I always go back to our coastal policy in Connecticut, which says one of my jobs is to prevent the depletion of indigenous species. So if there's something that could be done to stem the decline in this stock, which has been consistent for 15 years, then we have a responsibility to do it. So I think that kind of, to me, sets the frame for the conversation. Do we just give up, or do we acknowledge that there's a lower level productivity and try to manage toward that?
Tom Foti?
Again, when I'm talking about the Mid-Atlantic with the New England Interlopers District and Southern New England, as you call Southern New England, I look at this the same way as Dave does it, but also look at it as a business model. Lobstermen are not going to go out unless they can make a living. It's an expensive business. They lose traps. They have boats. It's heavy on gas or diesel, whatever they use. And so you're probably going to see a thinning out of the lobster fishermen. And, it's a real shame because it's such a historic fishery. But some of that is going to be self-regulating. If you can't make a living, if it's not going to be profitable, you're going to stop doing that. And we should be looking at how do we address that? How do we basically help the industry get through this tough period, besides basically with lobster? Because I think no matter what we're going to do, it's going to go down, and the industry is going to need some help to either adjust to another industry or maybe look at some kind of federal buyout for the programs. I'm not positive right now. If we did something, we were going to make a big difference on that. I'm just not sure. And so do we let it self-regulate itself down? Because, as I said, when they stop making a profit, they're going to stop fishing. It just perplexes me, and I'm really interested in what the lobstermen have to say about some of that.
Tom, to your point about a federal buyout, it was about 10 years ago when the stock was declining significantly, and some of the Rhode Island folks, some of the Mass folks, I think, both went to Congress looking for some kind of federal support and failed. And there was an interest in doing that. And so what has been taking place in the Area 2, which is the Rhode Island, Mass, a little bit of Connecticut, and the Area 3 gang is a self-funded buyout. So a lot of those vessel owners are kind of cannibalizing other businesses in order to prepare for the trap cuts that they've agreed to. So it would certainly be a different outcome to see federal support for this, but I guess it's not out of the question. Yes, go ahead.
You only had 2 states involved. When you have more states involved, you got more congressmen and more senators, so it might be more politically advantageous.
Fair point. Mark Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, thanks to David for hosting a very difficult meeting, and I tend to agree with him that I think there needs to be some reassessment of the reference points, what's realistic, given the conditions of low stock productivity, environmental change, and ecological challenges the lobsters face. Difficulty is we don't have any estimations of a reference point. If they didn't come out of this last stock assessment, we're probably not going to see those anytime soon. So I think a pivotal issue here is we have some stock projections. We had some at that meeting, and we have some, I don't know if they're revisions or just refinements from Burton Shanks or the Fisheries Service. And I think those are pivotal on this question. And I'm not really sure what the status of those is. They're in a briefing material, but I don't know if they've been endorsed by the technical committee or the PDT. And I think that's critically important because some of those projections are quite, as you noted, Mr. Chairman, quite pessimistic. Just to stabilize biomass at its current level required a substantial cut in mortality, either cutting M, which we really don't know how to do, or cutting fishing mortality, which we think we know how to do, but are reluctant to do so. So I think we need to I need to understand what the status of those is in terms of their peer review and their acceptance by the technical committee. Maybe that's a charge we need to make to the technical committee in terms of reviewing those projections, giving us some insight into how reliable they think they are, and then what do they tell us about a potential reference point adjustment. Thank you.
Megan will speak to that.
Yeah, so just to clarify, the projections in the meeting materials were from Burton, and it was a request from the subcommittee that the units be changed from spawning stock biomass to reference abundance. So that's what is shown there. In terms of them being reviewed by the TC or peer reviewed, they have not. So if that's something the board would like to do, then that should be tasked to the TC.
Next on my list, I have Lance.
Yes, good morning, and thank you, Dan. My concerns have been the concerns that have been expressed through me for the last 2-3 months and all from the Western Long Island Lobstermen's Association and several others that are involved in that kind of restricted area for habitat. And through the 15 years of different levels of mortality that we've had, I don't think we've really mounted a good scientific study, across the board, inclusively, that looks at DO and temperature and pesticides at the same time lobsters are fading or the bowl disease is affecting them. So I think we need, an ultimate synchronated, organized through the technical committee, study of one of the greatest populations that are going through mortality along the East Coast. I mean, this would be alarming and should be alarming as any other that the federal government and the states have coordinated in the past. So all I'm doing is asking an appeal, as all the fishermen have expressed to me, to get this data together. I have bits and pieces of DO and temperature that don't really correlate with a site station with a fixed number of lobsters in the traps that are really enumerated over and over again as far as how far they have died or whether they do die. They may have that weakened condition and not die. So I don't think we've done the science justice for this largely important animal, and that's what I'm asking the board. And you know, inclusively of, well, all over the Chesapeake, whatever, to take the attitude that this is one of the major stocks on the eastern border, and we haven't given it a definitive study yet. And we're looking at shutting down the fishermen with millions and millions of dollars and closing a traditional fishery. So those are, you know, those are the words that I get by phone, and as a biologist, this was my animal for 40 years. I have, you know, these subtle ideas, and they're real by a lot of scuba diving studies, that some lobsters in traps that look weak come up, and they may or may not die, but they have to be really verified to be in a condition that causes mortality. But in the environment, there are tremendous numbers of mud burrows and these grottos that go into the sediment of Long Island Sound, where lobsters that are free and are able to roam can avoid a 2-degree or 3-degree temperature change for a week or two. They could. I don't know whether they do, but it's certainly a possibility. So these sort of subtle things that affect this multi-million-dollar, you know, species industries should be laid out and you know, studied by. Not, it's, you know, it's a close geographical area. It's not like studying the whole continental shelf. So it's an easy study to do. The funding would be generated from Congress, we feel, instantaneously. But I think we need to have the urgency and the appeal made a little more prominent than we have in the last 15 years. Thanks, Dan.
Bill Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I mirror the other comments on new reference points. I think that's very important to lower the bar a little in expectation. But as far as I think the fishermen are still reducing, I believe, traps, and of course, also the number of fishermen are being reduced, as well as you just mentioned. So there is something going on which is reducing mortality, and I do recognize what the subcommittee had done, and I read the material. And what can we do? I don't think closing the fishery, I don't think that even reducing it by 75%, I don't, you know, that's just, I don't think that's working, gonna work. We do have the natural mortality. What do you do? Well, I think we bring an iceberg down and put it in Buzzards Bay, and it might cool the water a little. We could up the predator count so that we can catch more of those, because those things were also listed as a problem. Now, that's not going to bring all the lobsters back. But I also think that the ventless study should be, there should be a ventless study done outside where these fishermen are saying, yeah, we're doing fine. Where are you? Deeper, colder water, salted vineyard. That's what the biologist said. The lobsters leave town when it gets too warm, and then when they have their eggs, they don't come back into Buzzards Bay or you know, Narragansett Bay. They go somewhere else. So anyway, a ventless study, I think, would be should be done out there, just to put more information into our hands. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, Bill, to that point, I know that the Massachusetts Ventless Trap Survey is going into the EEZ, and I turned to Mark. Does the Rhode Island Ventless Trap Survey go out there as well? The Rhode Island Ventless Trap Survey, does it put traps in federal waters, or is it just state waters? Yeah. Okay. All right. Next, I have David Borden.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I attended the subcommittee meeting, and my takeaway message from that, this is a really difficult issue for all of us to deal with, and I think we've got to be right up front about the circumstance we find ourselves in. I mean, the will of that group was we can't envision doing the two extremes, which to me the takeaway conclusion of that is we need to do something. And I favor that type of approach. I think we've got to be fairly deliberate in terms of what we do. I would, and once again, this is in the mode of big picture, I think we should identify a whole number of taskings at this meeting, ask the technical committee or whatever the appropriate committee is to review it and bring action items back to the commission so that in fact we can take action. I don't think that we should ask the technical committee, which the commission did the last time they found themselves in this situation. What is the most effective way of conserving this stock? There's a simple answer for that: close the fishery. So if you ask that question, that's what the response is going to be, and we all know that. And I think what the message from the subcommittee was don't go there. That's not the appropriate message. So I think we've got to be upfront with ourselves and all the commissioners and the public that we're not going to close the fishery. But personally, I don't think we should give up on the fishery. I think there's a whole series of potential actions we can take to try to buffer the lobster resource in southern New England. You know, if you were to look at, and this is all out of the scientific reports, if you were to look at some of the condition of the fishery, it's horrible. There's no other way to describe it. But you know, so the recruitment's down, the landings are down, but there are some positive things that are going on in the fishery. You know, the fishing mortality is one of the lowest in the time series. The effective exploitation is one of the lowest in the time series. In terms of area 2 and 3, the number of traps fished is one of the lowest in the time series. Just using Rhode Island and Massachusetts on traps fished, in the heyday of the resource, 1999, those two states were fishing about 300,000 traps. After the trap cuts that the commission has approved, those two states will be fishing about 60,000 traps. At some point, those trap cuts are going to bite into the fishing mortality. So kind of my position on this is I think we should walk away from this meeting today with a whole series of taskings, let the technical staff and even the LCMTs actually work on some issues. I think one of the strategies should be to try to increase egg production. I'm not personally convinced that environmental change is the sole reason that this stock has gone down. I think it's a function of many factors, one of which is natural mortality and predators in the environment. And so there are ways to put more eggs into the water and increase the recruitment level with minor tweaks. The PRT looked at the issue, a whole series of recommendations, one of which was to look at consistency in some of the regulations and the impacts. I think a better way of saying it, the impacts of inconsistency on the regulations. I think that should be one of the taskings. We should task the committee. And I've got a number of other suggestions, but I'd like to hear other members of the board first. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Next, I have Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The other speakers have said much of what I wanted to comment on. We really need to re-examine the reference points. The reference points are being driven by that peak of the population, you know, Long Island Sound, Block Island Sound, Buzzards Bay, back in the 80s and 90s. That's what's driving this. That's what those reference points are based on. I don't think we're ever going to get there again. In fact, even the staff memo indicates that we may never get there again. So if we can't be in a situation where reference points are being driven by a situation that we're never going to achieve again. And if we look at abundance, abundance now is about where it was back in the late 70s. And if we were having this conversation back in the late 70s, we'd say, well, things aren't too bad. But we're having this conversation now after that peak in the 80s and 90s, and we're saying, well, things might be pretty bad. So as the other speakers have said, we need to re-examine that. In terms of effort, we've had a significant reduction in effort already. During the peak of this southern New England inshore fishery, there were almost 600,000 pots being fished. Now we're down to about 150,000. So there's been a significant reduction in effort already. Some of the issue, though, is that the number of pots being actively fished is significantly reduced, again, from about 600,000 down to about 150,000. But a lot of that gear is still out there. It's still out there in the water. It's still fishing. We've received some funding through Nov2015 and NOAA to remove some of these derelict pots. And so far we've retrieved 14,000 abandoned pots. Nearly half of them have the escape vent, I'm going to say compromised. When I say compromised, I mean that the escape vent is either still attached, the hog riggings haven't deteriorated, so that escape panel is still in the pot, or that end of the pot where the escape vent is either sunk into the mud or partially sunk into the mud. So even though the active number of pots being fished is less, there's still a lot of ghost fishing going on. So again, we've removed 14,000 pots. There's still a lot of abandoned gear out there. It's still fishing. The escape panels aren't coming off, and they're still catching lobsters. Probably about at least a third of the gear that we're retrieving have lobsters in them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next, Mike Luisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll keep my comments on one specific point that I think is going to be an issue that it's going to be a difficult one to try to fix, and that has to do with this concept of ending the fishery. And ending the fishery, I think, means different things to the different areas and the different fished areas of this southern New England area. So what I'm getting to is that, south of the Delaware Bay, the lobster fishery is not an inshore fishery. The lobster fishery is a deep water offshore fishery that requires enormous efforts to get to, prosecute, return home with a profit margin hopefully large enough to make the day worth it, or make the trip worth it over a course of a couple days. And so when I read through the documents and hear the suggestions that reductions on the order of 75%, even if it was 25%, if we were to even consider something around 15%, I'm not sure that the fishermen that I represent would be able to continue operating due to where this fishery is being prosecuted south of Delaware Bay. So, I'm also hearing from them that offshore stock, and I know that this issue was discussed at the subcommittee, but that offshore stock in the deep waters and the canyons, they're not experiencing the same declines. They're not seeing the same declines in their catch per unit effort over this period of the last 5 to 10 years. It's just not there. They're not seeing it, and it's a challenge when talking with them and explaining to them, what the science is saying, when they're not experiencing that themselves. So, I don't know what we don't collect a lot of information south of the Delaware Bay on lobster. We've begun a sampling program, an at-sea sampling program, to try to start gathering information, but in my mind, I think we might need to think about the science of this stock and looking at these different areas and determining whether or not these reductions are absolutely necessary on these, with the inshore versus the offshore fishery. And I'll just leave it with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Tony Can I ask you a quick question about funding opportunities or attempts at getting funding to look at the offshore stock? It wasn't, didn't the TC try to pursue that to no avail? Do you remember?
Like, for example, doing the ventless trap survey in the offshore fishery, or just general data collection in the offshore fishery?
I think they were trying to do some tagging studies to determine the linkages between the nearshore and offshore and some of the movement of lobsters in the deeper water.
I believe that someone may have applied for a couple of funding projects and they were not successful.
That's my recollection as well. Do you want to speak to that, Doug?
Yes, I know there was an ACCSP grant that my staff got involved with. We're going out having the AOLA do at-sea monitoring, and I thought they were going to try and add some tagging to that particular study too. From what I understand, I can find out from my staff if they did indeed start doing the tagging, if you'd like.
I only raise that because I think that is the conundrum that we're all facing. We think about it. We have nearshore areas that don't produce lobsters like they used to. We have offshore areas that appear to be producing lobsters at a much higher level, and the TC, I think, espouses the traditional linkages of, nearshore shallow habitat produces young lobsters, and those lobsters are eventually taken as adults offshore. But, that's the traditional thinking, and yet, to Mike's point, there seems to be this reservoir of older lobsters that continues to be available to the offshore fleet, and that's the disconnect. I mean, nobody is going to deny that the landings haven't plummeted in Long Island Sound or in Buzzards Bay, but how we manage this stock as a whole is really, really challenging. I have Pat Kelleher or Bob Beal.
Dan, is there an estimate of what this would cost, just so we can, put that into the priorities of the commission, and as funding opportunities are available, where, how much would this work cost, and we can get a sense of where that is on the commission's priorities and start weaving that into our process?
I don't have it, but I'd be happy to produce it, subsequent to this meeting. I'll talk to Bob Glenn about that.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful just to know, what ballpark we're working in, and then we can, see if there's SK funds or whatever it might be available that we can, latch onto and fund this work. So it sounds pretty important to the discussion and sorting through the Southern New England issue.
Pat Kelleher.
How about now, Joe? Beautiful. Technical difficulties. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to lend some support to the concepts that Dave Borden brought forward as far as tasking the technical committee. However, I do want to urge the board to consider not looking only at Southern New England if we are going to be tasking the technical committee. My staff has just completed, are in the process of completing the settlement survey for our state. It looks like we're going to be well below average for settlement for this year. This will be 4 out of 5 years. We're continuing to see some reductions within Western Maine, within our fisheries, compared to what we're seeing in Mid-Coast and down East Maine, where landings are still quite high. However, I want to make sure that we, as a board, take lessons and learn some lessons from southern New England about being ready to react to a changing stock. I think the signs are starting to show that we will see a changing stock in the Gulf of Maine. We know there's relationships from the Gulf of Maine stock back to Georgia's as far as tagging studies that have been done. I would encourage the board to consider adding some tasks to the TC that would look at some of those relationships and some of the differences with regulations between those areas. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Doug Grout? You good? Okay. Peter Burns? Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Richie? I had Richie next. My apologies. Sorry, Pete.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We started this 10 years ago, 15, whatever, with the recommendation of a moratorium. And we didn't do, we did what, 10% cut. I think we're to the point now where it's clear that the problem is environmental. We can't solve it with reducing fisheries mortality. And it seems that it's not an option, a moratorium is not an option. And I think the Commission, though, needs to call what we're going to do what it is. And I think it's important that we don't take some steps as it seems like we're going to take, and call it that we're trying to restore the stock. I think we need to call it that. We don't think the stock is probably recoverable based on peer-reviewed science. And we want to maintain a fishing industry and fishing infrastructure, and that's our goal. And I think we've danced around this for 15 years, and I think we need to come out publicly and describe what we're going to do as what it is. So, thank you.
Peter Burns, and then Pat Augustine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, this is certainly a very difficult problem, and I think that Richie makes a good point. I think what we have to really do is find some definitive goals on how we want to move forward, not just a 10% or some kind of a number that we're going to use. I think we need to look at, if we can't look at the reference points, then maybe it's Burton Shank's revised projections that we can use, and I think it was Mark Gibson that suggested that, and I thought that was a good idea to maybe give us some kind of benchmark of where we're headed on this, so that we can think about how we want the fishery to look, both the fishery and the stock, and what our expectations are going to be. And then from there, we can decide what kind of measures are going to work so that we can, maximize the opportunities for the industry and do what we can for the stock within the limits of natural mortality and other problems there. And I think as far as taskings go, one thing that comes to mind is to keep in mind that we have a trap transferability program that we've just unveiled, and fishermen are taking advantage of that in southern New England, mostly in Area 2 and 3. But that's, moving forward, that may be a very important tool for these fishermen to use to be able to mitigate through whatever measures that we end up having to put in place for this fishery moving forward. So I would recommend that any kind of tasking or any kind of development of measures would consider banking and the aggregate trap limits that we have in place in Addenda 21 and 22. We're looking at that right now, our agency, as part of changes to the trap transferability program. So if there's going to be any significant changes to how perhaps we do trap reductions, maybe the timing of those are going to impact some of the measures that have already been adopted into the plan. And if those need to be adjusted, then I think we should take all the things into consideration that we already have in place now to deal with southern New England that we've done already.
Thanks, Peter. Pat Augustine.
I'm going to try not to babble, but listening to what we've heard around the table, all the points that are very salient are very important. Richie hit it right on target. Let's face the facts. We're either going to close the fishery or not. We're either going to hurt the fishermen economically and put them out of business or not. The real problem is not the fishermen. We keep thinking that we can solve our problem by reducing fishing effort. And that's not the answer. The answer is a different approach. What is the mortality being caused by? No matter what the stock assessment is on black sea bass, for instance, and porgies for that matter, the SSC is a day late and about 3 years short for what is really happening on the water. We are doing single species management. Try to save a species. So we're going to try to save lobsters by wiping out the fishermen. What are we doing with black sea bass? We're reducing the quota. And if you're a fisherman been on the water for the last 3 years, you'll say, my God, what are we going to do with these things? And yet the SFC is reducing the quota because we're worried about the stock, because we don't know what the status is. Same way with porgies. What are we doing with striped bass? We reduce the take on striped bass by fishermen. And what's happening? You're seeing a resurgence in 1 year. I guess the point I'm making is in listening to things that Emerson said, getting ghost traps out of the water. They've done over 14 or 15,000 already, quietly gone about their business. If you were to drive out on Long Island and look at some of the ports where the ghost pots are packed and stacked, you would say, oh my God, they'd fill this room. And yet the average person doesn't realize that. Has Connecticut had any funding to do the same thing? Would they do it? If they had it, they probably would. I haven't talked to Mr. Simpson about it, but I would think that would be another approach. Rather than wiping out the fishery and killing off an industry that is very viable, and we know that habitat is an issue. Water conditions have changed. Connecticut has put in place reduction or, not being able to use certain chemicals in their waters, methoprene and some other things. They feel that that's been very beneficial to lobsters. That in addition to, well, New York is still using it. Maybe we have to look at that. But we're looking at trying to reduce fishing effort and not what's causing natural mortality. Why don't we look at ecosystem management for those major species of fish that are attacking lobsters? If they're black sea bass, let's get a real number. You cannot fish for black sea bass in Long Island Sound without pulling up a black sea bass 5, 6, 8 or 10 inches long that doesn't spit out baby lobsters. And that's throughout the whole of Long Island Sound. Now they've expanded up into the New England area. And if you think you have a problem now, you have no idea. We thought we had a problem with spiny dogfish. These things are worse than spiny dogfish. But the assessment is dragging its feet. I don't want to blame the SSC, but none of them want to make a mistake and say, oh, gee whiz, we gave you too much quota, you're killing them off. They're like ants. They produce the way they have to produce to sustain their species. So it seems to me that we need to review the reference points. They were moved up based on how the status of the stock was changing. As Emerson said, and if we look at where the baseline was in the 70s as to where it is right now, it's about the same. If you look at the active fishermen in our area, they're about the same number of pots in the water fishing that there were then. In the meantime, the stock increased. So we changed the threshold and the target. We've done the same thing with every species of fish. As a species comes back, we increase the target and the threshold. So the real question is, are we trying to bring the levels of these species up to artificial levels that will compete with each other? In the meantime, the subspecies such as winter flounder are falling by the wayside. What's eating them? If you're a diver, Dr. Stewart will tell you what's eating them. Everything in sight. So why don't we really take a real hard look at this? If we decide we're going to do anything other than send this back to the technical committee with advice as to what other studies they should perform, we are admitting that we don't know how to come up with a solution with all the brains around this table. We don't know how to come up with a solution other than hurting the fishermen. So I would think that if there's funding available, one of the first things that we might look at is awarding a grant money to those states that feel they can support removing ghost pots. That's an active move. Talk to Emerson about it, and he'll tell you the number of lobsters they found in the pots that they've taken out. They continue to fish. Go back and review the reference points Mark Gibson had mentioned. And we need to look at the economic value of other species of fish versus lobsters. Which one is the most important? What just so happens around this table, the most important species is the one we're talking about that affects your community. If it's striped bass, oh boy, we got to save striped bass. In this case, it's lobsters, which are very important. So those are the points I'd like to make. Single species management is good to a certain point, only if it works on our behalf.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you.
And what I'd like to do is, I've got Craig and Dennis. I want to come back to Dave Borden after that and talk about the multi-species aspect of trap fishing, because we took a substantial action at the last meeting to basically co-manage the Jonah fishery with the lobster fishery. So I think in some regards we're heading there. Craig Miner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I gave a lot of thought to this meeting on the way down here, and having read the passage number 3, where it says, in particular, human changes to the coastal ecosystem, it seemed to be something that people agreed was of great importance to this species. And I'm concerned that we might reach a conclusion that we have so damaged the ecosystem that it isn't recoverable, or at least isn't recoverable at some very low level. I've been in the constituent business probably for 25 years, and one thing that I will tell this board is that when you lose a constituency, you lose the interest and you will lose the money. If we have any interest in trying to find out what the drivers might be, whether it's predation, damage to the ecosystem, water temperature, an imbalance between effort and what this animal can sustain as a population, then I would suggest that the time to do it is now. If we make a determination that this is a done deal, Congress isn't going to appropriate a nickel. I can tell you our Connecticut government isn't going to appropriate a nickel. This is an area that has been cut from the budget more times in the last 5 years than I care to admit. And so it's not because some people don't care, it's because a majority of people don't care. And so my suggestion would be that we're very careful in how we craft whatever the guidance is, because if the guidance comes back with the determination that a moratorium and this is done is the direction we need to proceed, I can't imagine the state of Connecticut appropriating 50 cents to figure out why this fishery's gone away. And that isn't where I want to be.
Thanks, Craig. Dennis Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the biggest problem facing us today is, first of all, whether Pat Augustine's voice will last the full week. He's off to a shaky start this morning. Good to see you, Pat. To this issue, we've heard an awful lot of good comments, and I think for every point that's made, there can be a counterpoint made in another direction. Bill Adler would have us looking at predators. I mean, he's always been against the striped bass, and now the sea bass have entered the equation. Lance Stewart would like us to do more studies on the biology of the lobsters, which would be a good idea. But the problem facing us has grown past just southern New England. Pat Kelleher alluded to issues going on or beginning to go on in Maine, and I've been reading in the papers and in the clippings of things that are happening. I think whatever study that might be proposed really should be looking at a more global, this being a more global issue. Is it going to spread north of Cape Cod? Is it heading for Maine? The fact is climate change. We have to realize that climate change is a big driver. It's changing what's going on in the ocean. And as far as trying to limit the southern New England fishermen, I'm reminded of a governor's appointee that I rode to a number of meetings with when I first started. It was Steve Driscoll, who was a commercial fisherman. And he said, trying to restrict us to catching certain things, he says, isn't going to do a lot. He says, if they're not there, we're not going to go catch them. And I think Tom Foti alluded to that if it's not economically viable, they're not going to go fishing. So trying to change the amount of fishermen or place restrictions on them. They'll place their own restrictions. Do we want to have the responsibility of imposing a moratorium on southern New England? It'd be the bad guys. Do we want to be the ones sticking our finger in the dike trying to solve a problem that's really unsolvable? We have to acknowledge that the environment is changing, and if any study is to take place, we have to look at the bigger problem of what's happening and try and ask the technical committee to look at reference points and whatever is peeing into the wind. I mean, as Richie said and I've said, we've been looking at this for over 15 years, and fooling with the reference points and whatever is not going to change a darn thing. So surely I don't know the answer, but I think our problem is much bigger and growing, and we really have to pay attention to that problem.
Thank you. David Borden.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to kind of move this along, I'm not going to make this as a motion, but I'd like to just read that's much better. I can actually hear myself speak. I think we should task the technical committee with looking at the projections that were done by Burton. And while I'm on that issue, I'd like to compliment Burton for the work that he and the center staff are doing on this. They've really gotten engaged on the issue, and I think it's really helpful. So that would be one item on the list. The next item on the list is I think we should ask the technical committee to look at different ways of increasing egg production. Some of you have no doubt seen it, but there was a paper recent paper that was published in the Canadian Journal of Science on the Bay of Fundy, which basically indicates that egg production between 2008 and 2013 in the Bay of Fundy has decreased 8 to 10% per year, and they attribute that to environmental change. I think we need to look at ways to keep the egg production going. Pat Kelleher made the point that the recruitment indices are falling in the Gulf of Maine. There's been a continuous trend that way, recent trend that way. So one way to react is to figure out strategies that increase egg production. I think we need to look at, in a holistic form in all areas, we need to examine the cost and benefits and implications of our existing regulations. And that does not mean standardizing all those regulations. I think it means, and nor does it mean doing the most restrictive. But we have, and I've spoken to this point in the past, we have a situation where we have two sets of regulations in some areas. We have two different minimum sizes, two different maximum sizes. We have areas that have 4 different V-notch definitions. At some point, these have negative consequences, and I think we need some technical advice on that. I think the technical committee should recalculate the targets and thresholds, and I don't want to delude anyone. You're going to get the same conclusion out of that analysis if we come back, but there'll be an order of magnitude difference between the results. The resource is still going to be overfished. I think we need, which I've been trying to get, a table of egg production by size for each one of the LMAs. And I just note that sexual maturity is very different. If you look at sexual maturity in Long Island Sound, it's completely different than it is out on Georges Bank. I think we need to look, and Bob Beal raised this point before, I think we need to look at this whole relationship of the inshore and the offshore stock. Most of the tagging studies that were done date back to the period of time when I was tagging lobsters, which was 35 years ago. I think there would be a lot of merit in examining those, having the technical committee look at those tagging studies and basically come back to us with some recommendations. I also think that the technical committee, as part of that review, should go back. Tony Kearns, when she was just doing staff work on lobsters, wrote what I viewed as a superb summary of the problems in the lobster fishery, and this is kind of a holistic summary of the problems in terms of data collection, reporting systems, and so forth. I think we need to dig those documents out. I think it was addendum 12 or whatever, and Tony can correct that if that's wrong. But I think we need to dig those out and have the technical people look at that and then bring us recommendations on how to solve some of those problems. I think my conclusion is we have to get on with solving some of these problems and kind of standardizing some of the systems in place, and above all else, I think we've got to figure out ways and strategies to increase egg production. I also think that any strategy going forward should include the strategy of capping effort in these fisheries, and I understand that we don't have a perfect relationship between effort and fishing mortality, but the one thing that I would point out to everybody is that lacking such a strategy in all areas, you can be assured that the fishing industry will redeploy effort as we rebuild this population. So somehow we have to have a strategy that caps fishing mortality, or not fishing mortality, but fishing effort in all of these areas. Otherwise, we're going to take steps, and I would point out Bob Glenn has pretty much documented this from Massachusetts. He did an analysis of what's happening in the Massachusetts fishery in the last year, and what you find is that the landings are going down and the catch per unit is going up. And so the perspective from the industry is things are getting better, but it's a smaller and smaller industry is what's happening. So the people that are still surviving in the industry in Massachusetts are actually seeing the benefits of less traps in the water. So personally, I think we need a strategy to effectively cap the effort. And for Long Island Sound, as an example, that may mean starting, I think they're down 96% from their record high amount of effort, but that may mean just capping it at 4% or something like that. So those would be, on my list, those would be the taskings for the technical committee. Thank you. Sorry to take so long.
Can I get some feedback, David Simpson?
Yeah. I think Craig and I are on the same page in terms of the need for a constituency to have anyone out there who cares about an issue. And you know, what Area 2 is doing is that's fine. I think it's a very expensive way for people to have to stay in business, to have to pay somebody else to leave. So I'm not an advocate. All of the conversation and a lot of our conversation about lobster and effort controls, to me, is reminiscent of the 1980s and groundfish management, and we know what that did. Not much. I think if you want to manage a fishery, we learned with every other species you have to manage output, not input, and you would need some kind of quota and cap and let individual areas decide how to manage that fishing mortality rate. The idea that cutting traps is going to do anything for conservation, I think, is faulty logic, and some of the results that are shown in the report, I think, support that. You know, we hear that over and over from fishermen. You know, effort's been reduced 90%. You know, there isn't a problem anymore. But, you know, I look at this room and somehow it reminds me, it makes me think of Long Island Sound, the western two-thirds, and I think of this center as being the center of the sound and down on the corner being the west. There used to be 750,000 pounds of landings out of this space right here between us. And last year there were 2,000 pounds. So what good did it do that all that effort went away? It means nothing. The effort remains down over where Steve and Bob are sitting, where there's a couple of pockets where lobsters are left, and that's where the pots will go. And so that, we've had tremendous contraction in this stock, from 75 to 85% occurrence in our trawl survey of lobsters, down to as little as 10% occurrence. So 10% of sites left are producing lobsters. Well, guess where fishermen set their traps? In the places that still have viable concentrations of lobsters. So it's a losing cause to engage in this conversation about trap limits and conservation. If you want to do it for economic reasons, that's fine. I think that's, governments to decide. But if our mission here is conservation, then it's misplaced. It's a misplaced conversation. I think, again, we hear that, we get that from every angle. Effort's down 90%, so there shouldn't be a problem. It's concentrated where where any remaining stock of lobsters are. So I'm very wary of the Area 2 approach of make remaining fishermen buy each other out. Being exported to Long Island Sound, where I frankly have a little different view of how many constituents we can support with small numbers of traps versus a few big players that concentrate their traps, which will then be concentrated in the remaining pockets of viable concentrations of lobsters. So I'm all for conservation, but let's be clear and distinct whether we're talking about economic, social engineering, or whether we're actually talking about lobster population conservation.
Let me circle back to the document. There is a number of possible objectives, and one of them is to slow the rate of decline in the spawning stock biomass. So, David, that seems to capture what you're attempting to do with that motion. And the second one is to prevent loss of fishery infrastructure, and that's what you're trying to do. And then I think you mentioned looking at regulations, and I'm interpreting that to mean you want to improve compliance and enforceability with the existing rules and not have one LMA's fishermen undermine another, especially in overlap zones, and that you want to make these rules cleaner, and maybe some conservation comes out of that at the end of the day because some lobsters get put back in the water because you have consistent rules. Is that accurate? Okay, so does that get us towards some objectives that and among the others that you put on your list that we could ask the TC for help? I mean, David objects to the formula of a sort of a self-funded buyout among participants, but I think you have some nuggets here of declining, of trying to slow the rate of decline, prevent loss of fishery infrastructure, improve compliance, and then some of your other measures which you mentioned could even go north, looking at improving egg production.
Yeah, that's a general direction. I honestly don't think we have the information at this point that we need to make the decisions on where we want to go. David Simpson's point, I totally agree with his point. I was not suggesting that Long Island Sound adopt Area 2 or Area 3 type trap program. What I was suggesting is if you don't do something about the traps in the water, then they're going to come back. They'll increase as the population increases unless you have output controls. And so I think it's just a way of making the other measures actually work. Thank you.
David, why don't we do this? Why don't we try to make that list up, give it to staff? Why don't we move on to some of the Jonah crab issues and then come back to this one, and we'll all sort of see if we can come to consensus on your list of ideas. Does that make sense? We good with that? All right. Tony, you good with that? All right, so we're going to suspend discussion on that for now, and let's go to a discussion of a future addendum to set effort controls for the Jonah crab-only trap fishermen. Megan, did you want to speak a little bit to that as background?
Yeah, hold on one sec. So at the last meeting, we passed the Jonah crab FMP, and since that time, we've been trying to go back and learn a little bit more about the fishery to make sure we made the right decisions. And so there are 3 areas that we would like to discuss today to just kind of open it up and see what thoughts are. So I'll start with the first one, which is the Jonah crab only trap fishermen, and I'm going to pass it over to Jim Gilmore, who's going to talk about this. But this was our last board meeting. We said we would create an addendum for effort control measures on these fishermen, so that is following through with what we said we were going to do.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick refresher. At the last meeting, we had an issue with state-only fishermen, and that they were sort of kept out of the fishery. So the addendum on the board that was, or the motion on the board that was passed, allowed for them to participate in it, but we needed some sort of effort control. The problem with the point back at the August meeting was that we really didn't have any data to figure out what that would be. So we agreed to look into that and maybe initiate an addendum today, which we actually may have to delay a little bit longer as we get into this, because first off, the data that we've compiled through the fishery in a second, we'll go through the slides in a minute, but the data is a little bit inconsistent, for lack of a better term, and we also looked at the claw fishery, which we'll get to in a little bit, and the data is kind of poor on that. So what I thought we would do is maybe first go through just the crab-only fishery in state waters, give you the data we've gotten, and then show you what some of the problems are, and then maybe have some discussion about it, because I think we need to get consistent data before we start initiating an addendum, because the solution may be different depending upon the data we have. So if we go through our slide presentation that Megan did a great job putting together, what we know so far is there are fishermen in Rhode Island, New York, and Maryland. There's about 15 state-only fishermen in total that fish both in state and federal waters, and the total landing are about 143,000 pounds. So again, the data, I think even up until the middle of last week, we were getting different numbers depending upon, Megan was sending out emails, and then we get responses, and even from New York, we were getting just different information. So we still need to get the data correct, but we really came up with a few questions. First off, is the goal to cap the effort at the current levels? And what is an effective effort control? Is it trap allocations? And then what data is needed to establish the effort control? What criteria can be used to identify these fishermen, and is it necessary to identify these traps differently from the lobster traps? So what seemed to be a simple thing back in August got a little bit more complicated. So the recommendation we really have is maybe to send this back to the PDT to get the baseline data, so that we can then more effectively answer these questions. But we figured it'd be a good time to talk about them at this point, so we maybe focus our efforts with the PDT as we move forward. And then the plan would be is to initiate an addendum at the February meeting once we get all the data and the approach that we think is the most logical. So at that point, I'll hand it back to you, Mr. Chairman, for any discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think some of the key questions that I can bring out at this point would be the eligibility time period. You know, what window of time does the board want to consider to qualify a boat to participate in the Jonah crab trap fishery? What data would be accepted? Is it, signed catch reports? Would it be log books? I mean, I think especially I look at Peter Burns, NIMS folks have had a lot of experience with these limited access programs, and sometimes they have to get creative and be flexible in terms of what data are going to be accepted. And then how do you determine the number of traps fished if the data is kind of squirrely? And then I did have a question for you. You mentioned earlier, you talked about state-only fishermen who fish in state and federal waters. So I guess we have to try to determine if through the investigations of the individual fishermen, did they fish in state waters, and did they also fish in federal waters? Because ultimately, NIMS is going to have to qualify them as well if that's the intent to do something in the federal zone. So is there any discussion on some of these points among the board? Yes.
Thank you,
Rob.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Rob.
I guess, can you hear me?
Yes, Rob.
Thank you. So I was in touch with Megan, and I'm just making sure I'm not out of step, but at the previous meeting, there was some discussion about non-lobster gear, and specifically gear that was set for sea bass, for example. And I think it would be partly state but mostly federal waters, and there was a recognition that there would be some type of landings records that would be needed in order to allow continued participation for, it's really a bycatch of Jonah crabs. What has changed on that compared to August? And I did not attend the last Jonah crab meeting, so I'm not really sure what the next step is, but it sounds like it's going to fall similarly to what Jim is talking about, at least for the federal waters. And for the state waters, if you can prove there's been state landings in whatever the amount of years is, or recent time, how will that play forward? Thank you.
So my understanding from the wording of the permit section from the FMP review is that those fishermen you're talking about would require an incidental permit from the state to be able to land Jonah crab. And right now what we're talking about are Jonah crab only trap fishermen who do not have a lobster permit. So I don't believe anything has changed from the last meeting in regards to those fishermen.
But I think it would be very useful to delineate the level of landings and the participation, because I think that's an important part of what we want to capture in this addendum, is to institutionalize that fishing opportunity for the guys who've been doing it, especially if they were doing it in a sea bass trap. Maybe a trip limit would make sense for that fleet, as opposed to what appears to be more of a directed fishery on the part of the lobster pot fishermen, which in a lot of areas is kind of a lobster and Jonah crab target fishery. So I think it's valuable to get that out, and so we'll make sure that when we pursue this between now and the next meeting, that we reach out to you and you can bring that data forward. Would they be on VTRs?
Yes, but also there's a little bit of state access too, not a lot, but as you go further north in the state, there is some.
And would those data be captured in trip level reporting of some kind?
They would be captured in mandatory reporting for the state.
That's great. Richie White, and then Doug.
Dan, can you remind me why, for these 15 fishermen, why we can't just require them to have a lobster license?
The motion and what was passed in the previous meeting was to accommodate these folks, and I know that my colleagues at the National Marine Fisheries Service were sensitive to this, because there was no requirement, federal requirement, for vessels that did not have a lobster permit to report or to participate. So the rules were very clear. If you had a lobster permit, you had to account for all of your traps. If your vessel and you had no federal lobster permit whatsoever, you were free to set gear, period. And that differs from New England in the Gulf of Maine, where Maine, your state, and Massachusetts all require the landing of Jonah crabs to be done by only those who hold a commercial lobster permit. But once you get west of Massachusetts, the rules were not as clean, and so we're trying to capture the historical participation of some number of vessels, and that's been the challenge for me, is to try to really get a handle on this. So that's what we're hoping to do between now and the next meeting. And I think we're really trying to sort of kick the tires on that particular motion that was passed to see if we can capture these vessels, see if they have legitimate landings records, so that we can, not we, my state, I don't think your state would be accommodating them because of your historical laws, but maybe the states to the west would be doing that. Jim?
And Richie, we have no prohibition on new lobster licenses in New York. So, and the purpose of this was that if I could give them new licenses, that was one way of solving it, but I can't. So therefore, they'd be excluded from the fishery, which was not the intent. Thanks.
This population may be so small that we might decide at the end of the day that it might be the way to go. But I think we still are struggling trying to enumerate the scale of the fishery. Doug Grout.
Jim, you referred to these as 15 state-only fishermen between the 3 states, but you said they fish in both state and federal waters. So they can fish in federal waters for Jonah crab without any other permit, or do they have, how are they fishing out in federal waters if they're state-only fishermen?
I'm not sure. Megan may have to answer this. In New York, there's state-only permits, whatever, and that was actually the number we had. I thought I had about a dozen. I actually have fewer than that right now. But then we get into, it seems like Rhode Island had more than we had, so that's why it started getting a little confused. So maybe Megan can answer that better than me.
So from the emails I've had with the different states, the New York and Rhode Island fishermen are only in state waters. The Maryland fishermen are in state and federal waters, fishing in both state and federal waters.
And they have some kind of a federal permit to fish out there, or they just go fishing out there?
I'm not...
Mike Walese, you want to speak to that?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This was news to me. Seeing Maryland up on the board wasn't something I wasn't waiting to see. I wasn't aware of that fishermen were landing Jonah crabs outside of having a lobster permit. But what I can speculate is that those fishermen have sea bass permits, and they're bringing some crab claws in and landing those and reporting those, and it's showing up in somebody's data warehouse somewhere. But that is a point. I'd like to figure out who those folks are, and so that I can understand a little more how our fishery is operating. Thanks.
Doug?
And so the follow-up, then, that really would be an issue related to the other addendum on this, on our menu here, on our agenda here. It seems to me when we at least initiated this, what we were just trying to do is cap the participation. We just need to figure out who is just doing Jonah crab only, and just say, okay, cap the number of people participating in it. And I agree with you that we probably have to have some kind of a time frame. But again, we don't know the status of this resource. We're trying to put in some basic measures here, basic conservation measures, and to cap the level of effort. So I don't think we should get too complicated here in this, at least during this initial round of management.
I agree, Doug. But I think, just to put this issue to bed, what we really need to do is have the states and maybe NIMS reveal to in the most detail they can about these landings, so that we can intelligently look at some of these records and say, aha, to Rob O'Reilly's point, this is a sea bass potter that was landing Jonah crab as bycatch. Maybe that's resolvable by a bycatch limit for sea bass pots, as opposed to creating a whole new standalone fishery with its own trap tags and all of that. So a lot of this data I've discovered is not that reliable. I got a call from Jim Gilmore's staff that said, hey, you've landed 30,000 pounds of claws in your state. What do you mean nobody's landing claws in your state? Well, it turns out it was a dealer that was miscoding the records. And so when he called them, we said, do you buy claws? He said, no, we only buy whole crabs. So you got to get into this data and understand understand it in its finest level of detail before you create policies to capture all this. So I don't think we truly understand yet the scope and the specifics of this. People in my staff call it a phantom fishery, but I'm sure it's being done. So let's capture it. Let's let the PDT, pour through it. Let's figure out what permits these vessels held. And then let's come back with a really smart proposal, a set of proposals for the next addendum. So that's what we want to do, and that's what I'd like to see come out of this meeting today is an examination of the records of who's participating and under what permits did they hold it, and how detailed are the records about catch and effort, and also during what time period. And I would suggest like a 3-year window. So what we'd like to do is to task the PDT. I got Bill Adler. Go ahead.
I think that's what I was going to move this along, to task the PDT to do what? List the things to help them go off on their way. Can we do that?
Yes, I would say that working through the plan coordinator, the PDT would examine catch and landings records from states and from NIMS to try to characterize the participants in the fishery who are landing Jonah crabs with traps and who did not have a lobster trap permit, to understand the scale of this fishery and to determine and make recommendations for a future addendum to be able to write an intelligent regulation to capture them or to institutionalize that activity if possible. Tony.
And Dan, just to make sure it's clear that it will be that the coordinator or the chair of the PDT, which is Megan, will be asking each state to give us your information for your individuals and how many traps they're fishing. This is not something that we can find in the data, so we will be relying on the states and the agency to tell us who these individuals are. And so until the states give us that information, the PDT will not be able to begin their tasks.
And part of the challenge, Tony, is to not only look at the vessel and the landings, but to look at the permit status of that vessel during those times of landing, so that we understand under what authority they were fishing and setting whatever traps. And I think then it will all become clear. Right now, it's just so hazy. Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So is this sufficient? We don't need a motion to do this. Can we just take what you have listed and Tony's response about coming after the states to get that information? Is this sufficient to move this issue along?
Is this sufficient?
Yes, this
based on the discussion?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. And are there any objections, Rob O'Reilly?
Not an objection. I'm just trying to figure out something here. So I was under the impression, which is why I asked the question earlier for Megan, about the state permit, the incidental permit. And so I can understand with what Jim brought forward that you want to know the universe of those who are bringing in Jonah crab, which is a very small universe in Virginia. It's going to be confidential data. So, number of trips within the last 3 years, within the last 5 years, whatever is fine. I sort of think what Doug was saying is a little bit of reality, that if other states are like Virginia, really it's been the lobster permits. That's where the Jonah crab landings are coming from. You're not going to find much magnitude with the non-lobster trap folks or the non-lobster permit folks. So nonetheless, if this is now going to be an addendum to get at that detail, I just would recommend that maybe trips and participation. I'm not sure what ASMFC really would want to see. Again, I can tell you it's going to be a very, very small amount of participation coming out of Virginia.
Thank you, Rob. All right. Tom?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a clarification, these tasks are for those who land Jonah crab only? Or is it for because most of our lobster guys do land Jonah crabs, but this is just for those who only land Jonah crabs?
Yeah, the motion that was passed at the last meeting allowed states to come forward with records on the finite number of individuals that did not have a lobster permit and were setting traps for Jonah crabs. We're trying to get a handle on the number of people who did that, the scale of that fishery in terms of traps fished, and it probably means sharing some confidential records about the trip, and then us being able to, or someone being able to look into the permit status to determine if in fact that was fished under the authority of the lobster permit or not. So we're just trying to see how many guys there actually were. I mean, again, this has been so frustrating because it's been kind of a boogeyman. Even during the scoping meetings, we had very few people show up. I guess a handful of Rhode Islanders did show up and talk about that they did it in state waters. So we need to get a handle on it. Is this a state waters only issue? If so, that would be great. Is this a federal waters issue? And if so, Peter Burns' group is keenly interested in finding a way to accommodate that under the plan. Okay, so let's move on to the brief discussion on clause. Do you want to continue that conversation, Jim?
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're going to continue our slideshow any moment. Actually, I'll frame it a little bit. When we talked about the last meeting, there was some exemptions for, I believe it was Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, and New Jersey in terms of the claw-only fishery was, or the claw fishery, I shouldn't say claw-only. The claw fishery was looking at just a handful of participants. But as we started compiling the data on that, it turns out that was a bit of a surprise because some of the states were correct, some of them weren't. And it turns out when I got back home in New York, we had some claw fishermen. So anyway, if you look at the presentation, only whole crabs may be retained and sold with the exception of individuals who can prove a history of claw landings before the June 2nd, 2015 control date in the states of New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. If we go to the next one, what we know so far is that there is fishermen in those states, but also in New York. New York's not exempt under that motion. We kind of did that motion on the fly. We didn't have the data again. It was more, and again, after we looked at the data, we were looking at, I think most of the permits, we're talking 1 or 2 per state. Some of them went up into 15 or 20. Depending upon which state you were in. So there was a total of 46 fishermen in total, which is much more than expected, and in state and federal waters. And then not all the reports distinguish between the claws and the whole crabs, and there's some reporting information problems. As Dan had indicated, we first looked at it and said, oh my God, Massachusetts has got a whole lot, but it turns out, no, it was a coding error. Are the current claw exemptions appropriate from what we passed that last motion? And it seems like if no, which I think it might not be, are other management measures more appropriate? A minimum size, a maximum poundage might be a better way to handle this than just giving a grandfathering exemption to a handful of fishermen, because it really appears like we don't have a handful of fishermen, we have a lot more. And what data do we need to support these management measures? What criteria should be used to exempt a fisherman to land claws? Some of the information my staff found out is that even the way they're doing the claw fishery is very different from area to area. One guy's breaking off one claw, throwing the whole crab back. One guy's keeping the whole crab, breaking the claws, but then, they're doing both. They're using the claws and the whole crab. Some guy was breaking off both claws and sending them back, thinking that was a conservation measure, whatever was in his brain. But in any event, the way the fishery itself is prosecuted doesn't seem to be consistent or make a lot of sense. So again, we need some more information about this fishery. And again, what we did at the last meeting doesn't seem to be addressing a proper management of it, because that exemption was not on a handful. It's actually a significantly larger number. Still a small amount, but we still need to address it better. So at that point, we'll open it up for discussion on this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Jim, talking to some of your staff, I was told that in some cases whole crabs are landed, but sometimes only the claws are sold. And so that sort of speaks to the challenge of the data reflecting reality.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. It's like, again, the way this, the claw fishery is done is very different, and even within a state.
I think it's probably going to require some personal interviews beyond what we can learn from SAFIS to try to get to the root of this. Are there any questions or comments around the table? Yes, Tom, and then I'll get to you, Bill.
Thank you. I just wanted to share with the board. I met with our at-sea observers that go out on the lobster trips, and most of their trips, the lobstermen will land the Jonah crabs. It looks like, as far as whether they're going to land claws or whole crabs, depends on the demand. Buyers will go to the dock and tell the fishermen, I'm buying whole crabs, and that's when they'll bring back the whole crabs. Otherwise, it seems like they're bringing back the claws. Some observations that they have made, they've seen crabs come up with no claws and no new growth where for the new claws to come in. They haven't seen new claws, and I'm not sure about the regeneration at all. And I'm not sure, and if someone wants to enlighten us, that would be great. But it seems like it's as far as claws versus whole crab, it's a demand.
Thank you. Bill Adler?
If we have to change this, this is technical stuff, if we have to change this to make some adjustment, this was in an amendment, and can you do it by an addendum, or do you have to go back around amendment-wise? How does that work?
So we would be looking to do an addendum to change it.
So the addendum can modify the amendment. The wording is in there that will allow us to do it by addendum.
I believe it's in the adaptive measures part.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so Doug?
So again, certainly the people that are landing whole crabs and then selling the claws, that's really, it should be irrelevant to this issue because they're landing the whole crabs. So they shouldn't even be included in this analysis from my perspective. Even though they're marketing the claws at the dock, they're complying with what the intent of this plan was. So I'm again arguing here for simplicity here as we move forward if you want to grab more information, but the point was, let's just cap this. And the other thing I'd still like to add into this, if we are going to allow a claw fishery to go forward under a sort of a grandfather clause, it behooves us to try and do a study to see what the impact of removing a claw is from a crab. Do they grow them back? Do they survive? If they're dying or not surviving, then why don't we just continue to require them to land them whole, and then they can sell their claws and maybe figure out another use for the body as bait in a lobster trap or something like that. So that's my yeah, let's go out and find more information, but let's not get too complex right now with it.
Megan, maybe we can ask the TC to do a literature review on the regeneration rates on Jonah crab claws. All right. Okay, I think, again, we're going to ask the PDT to look at the same kind of records that the states are going to bring forward, and it probably means the states are going to have to do a little bit of homework on their own, informal fact gathering, because the data is so inadequate. I think the next issue we should cover is the non-trap bycatch limit. And Megan, did you want to speak to that?
Well, while Jeff gets the presentation up, I'll start. This issue was raised by both the New England Council and GARFO, and they were concerned that the trip limit or the incidental bycatch limit that was set at the last meeting was inappropriate for some of these larger trawl fishermen. So just for review, this is what we have right now. We have a 200 crab per calendar day, 500 crab per trip incidental bycatch limit for non-trap gear. And then I also have the lobster trip limit up there, just in case we want to be consistent between the two species on trip definitions. So for lobster, it's no more than 100 lobsters per day, up to a maximum of 500 lobsters per trip for trips that are 5 days or longer. So I asked both the council and GARFO to send me data to kind of support what they were saying. And so this is the New England Council data. It shows the number of trips from this non-trap gear from 2010 to 2014. The green area is those trips that are within the limit, the current ASMSC limit, and the red are the trips outside of the limit. So right now, between 99 and 97% of trips are currently within the ASMSC limit. I also had GARFO send me data, and their data pretty much corroborated what New England Council sent me. So their data went from May 1st, 2013 to August 31st, 2015. There were a total of 372 trips. 98% of those were within the current limit. 95% landed less than 200 crabs, which is right now our 24-hour calendar day trip limit. And only 7 trips exceeded the current limit, with 3 trips over 900 crabs. I believe, Terry, I'm just going to pass this over to you because I think the council is still interested in increasing the bycatch limit for non-trap gear, so I'll let you speak to that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Megan, for providing part of the summary I was going to provide. But following the summer board meeting, when I objected to the non-trap landing limit based on the comments submitted by the council, as Megan said, GARFO also submitted somewhat similar comments, and both the council and GARFO provide the information which is included in our supplemental materials. In summary, as Ashton presented, it's a very small, but it's a historic dayboat fishery primarily based in southern New England. At this point, the data captures the number of trips, but not the number of vessels. And overall, the non-trap landings are only about 1% of the total amount of Jonah crabs landed per year. As Ashton indicated, 2 to 3% of these trips were greater than the Commission's limit, and most of these trips were greater than 900 pounds. So I will continue to argue that these vessels should be able to continue their practice of landing more than the current limit, particularly given the previous discussion when other small-scale effort is being considered to be allowed as part of the FMP. So at the next board meeting, or whenever we're ready and it's timely, I will make a motion to either increase and or eliminate the non-trap limit as part of the Jonah crab addendum. So any board discussion today will help inform the council's discussion for the December meeting when the council will determine its 2016 priorities.
Thanks, Terry. David Borden, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the concept that Terry's discussing. This is really as I think everyone around the table knows, I represent a association that has the predominant landings in the Jonah crab fishery, and as such, I recuse myself from making motions and voting, but I can speak. So. This is a non-issue. As far as I'm concerned, the percent is so small that if we accommodate, as Terry has suggested, a liberalization, it's going to be virtually meaningless in the scheme of things. And so I would support that when it comes up. Thank you.
David, would you support eliminating the non-trap limit or liberalizing it?
Liberalizing it.
Terry, if the limit were liberalized, do you have a number?
No, not at this point. I was going to listen to the board's discussion, but I would. I mean, one or the other. The numbers are so small. It's as David said, it's inconsequential.
David.
Just this for everyone's edification. The Jonah crab fishery, and this is why I said what I just said. The Jonah crab fishery, the boats that are participating in that fishery now are basically offshore lobster boats. They're all equipped with RSW systems, and the boats that Terry is talking about are draggers and gill netters and so forth. And you know, just so everyone is clear, no one in their right mind would ever go target Jonah crabs with a gill net. If you've ever picked a Jonah crab out of a gill net, it's the most aggravating, dumbfounding thing you could possibly imagine. So this is truly a bycatch. You know, no one's going to do this. Coupled with the fact that the market then supports it by most people don't want to eat Jonah crabs that have been on ice for 5 or 7 days. They want an RSW product. So, you know, liberalizing this is fairly meaningless. It wouldn't trouble me at all to bump the limit up to 1,000 crabs a trip. Thank you.
I have 1,000. Do I have another bid? All right, Terry, are you good with, yes, David Simpson?
Yeah, I frankly never understood and never supported the idea of a default, you know, dedicating a resource to a certain gear type unless there is some compelling conservation issue that I'm not aware of. I don't know why we would, you know, just adopt a restriction on a fishery that's been going on out there. So I don't see the need for a limit unless somebody told me that a targeted non-trap fishery would cause some kind of concern, you know, getting into habitat that would be destructive or something like that. I don't see a need for separate rules.
So you'd be in favor of an addendum that repealed the non-trap limit? Doug?
So currently, Terry's right, and so is Dave, that this seems to be a non-consequential to trying to put a cap on or to try and prevent further growth of the crab industry here. The question is, are we going to be able to continue to monitor this to make sure that in the future there isn't some growth of this kind of landings? Maybe somebody starts putting in raw seawater. There's a lot of groundfish fishermen out there looking for things to add value to their catch, and this could be, although it is not right now, something that they could be looking at in the future. So I think it would behoove us, if we did remove the trip limits on them, that we monitor the fishery closely on a regular basis as a part of our compliance plans.
Thank you, Doug. Terry?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Doug. I mean, certainly these are federal vessels fishing in federal permanent vessels fishing in federal waters, and as David said, they're primarily dayboat draggers and gill netters. They do daily VTRs. We have the data. The council works. Staff can work with the commission staff to share this data. If it looks like it's going to be a runaway issue, the council will be the first to step forward to move forward with a management plan to constrain the effort.
The council wouldn't ask the commission to do it?
The council would be leading the charge, probably requesting the commission to do it. My sense of urgency in getting some support from the board here is to circumvent the council from becoming directly involved.
Understood. And if we have a viable management plan, we could make that addendum pretty quick, probably in the span of 6 months. So we'll work together on that. All right. I think we're done with this item. Do we want to circle back to what? Go ahead, Tony.
Dan, it would be great to have on the record a motion to initiate an addendum to review the trip limits.
Do we want an addendum that would be taking on all 3 issues, or do we want a motion that only addresses the non-trap limit?
That's at the discretion of the board. I don't know how long it'll take to tackle some of the other issues. If we can get all the data from the states for the Jonah crab only trap fishermen and get that information for February, we would be happy to include it all in one document. I don't know if that's going to be a feasible time frame for that, though. And we can do these addendum probably with little hearings, since it's a pretty simple document.
Bob Beal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it would be wise for this board to get a list of items you want to change through the addendum process or implement through the addendum process, and then we can make that either as a series of motions, or you can do it all as one wrap-up motion toward the end of the meeting, and then the staff can work with you on the timing of those and how quickly the data becomes available. And if the data is slow for some of the components, when you want to move forward with the trip limit issue very quickly, we can separate out some of the different items into multiple addenda if necessary. But we will need motions to initiate an addenda. It's up to your discretion if it's for each item or as a sort of catch-all at the end of the process.
Well, I'm confident that the Clar exemption and the Jonah only trapping could probably take 6 months to resolve. So, Terry, do you want to comment on whether you think a modification to the non-trap limit done sooner would be desirable?
Given that timetable, I would then make a motion to initiate an addendum to remove the non-trap landing limit from the Jonah crab FMP.
Is there a second? Dave Simpson, second. Any discussion? Terry, do you want to speak to it?
Well, I'm comfortable with the thought of the board responding to deal with the non-trap issue in an upcoming addendum. Should this the crab issue, the crab claw issue, and the other Jonah crab related issues drag out for some part of a better year, particularly as this board gets involved with Southern New England activities, I'm concerned that the non-trap issue will fall between the cracks, and that if it's a simple process, as Bob outlined, that we can move forward with without public hearings, we could do it expeditiously and get it behind us.
All right. Any other comments? Doug Grout.
So my comment is a question based on the big picture here. We have two other issues, the Jonah crab state-only issue, and then the crab claw issue. And under the amendment that we just passed, what happens on June 30th if we don't have some kind of management action in place for these fisheries? Do they end? Because I was under the impression that when we approved that we were going to try and do a follow-up addendum quickly to have something in place by June 30th, because otherwise these fisheries were going to end.
So my understanding is for the Jonah crab only trap fishermen that right now they are able to fish at their will. So they are not cut out of the fishery on June 1st. They are just able to fish unlimited amounts of Jonah crab if they desired to do that. So that's why we were trying to put in the effort controls. Likely those will not be in by June 30th, so that will be what happens on June 30th. We can implement the other measures of the FMP, such as the minimum size. That is something that states can implement and give me their plans for by January 1st. But these other measures where we're going through addendums, I think we would have to wait on those.
So it isn't going to stop either fishery right now?
No.
David?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My assumption is this wouldn't be a one alternative addendum. I think it would better serve the public purpose if we had like a range of options, including this option on it. And I think if we're going to adopt this strategy, because of the points that Doug Grab made earlier about trying to cap the effort in the fishery. In other words, not allow an expansion of effort, if for no other reason than to continue to protect protected species, that it would be desirable to have some other options in here. For instance, doubling the existing bycatch limit, putting a cap on the fishery so that it would operate under this rule with no restrictions unless it exceeded a certain level, and at which point it would trigger some restrictions. And I'm not saying we want to do that, but there are some other alternatives I think would probably enhance this.
Doug?
Yeah, I would support that. Maybe having even a higher trip limit in addition to the trip boat 5-day trip limit. Maybe there'd be we have some data here now in which to base a trip limit on. Maybe just having an option like that in there too. So,
do you want to offer a friendly amendment? Do you want to make a substitute motion? What do you want to do?
Yes, I can offer a friendly amendment unless the maker of the motion. Are you willing to take a friendly amendment to also have an option to put a higher trip limit in and to also cap the fishery at the percentage level that they are at right now?
I think we could certainly friendly and to remove or increase the non-trap bycatch limit, but we have a limited fishery as it is. There's X amount of federal permits. And I don't believe it's a trip fishery. I think the thought of having a split limit is somewhat inappropriate for this fishery. We're not going to have boats out there on a 5-day trip fishery, as David said, with putting crabs on ice. If the board was comfortable with the TC coming up with I would suggest, off the top of my head, I would suggest a bycatch limit of 1,000 pounds as a secondary cap. It would be higher than some and lower than the maximum, but it would be at least some discussion.
Any comments? So you're accepting that friendly amendment to have two options. The first is to remove the trip limit, and secondly, to enact a 1,000 pound limit. Dennis?
I friendlied myself, so it would be up to David if he accepts that, I guess, and then a subsequent board discussion.
Dennis Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just from a parliamentary sense, I think if someone wants to modify the main motion, they should amend the motion rather than asking the principal to whether he likes it or not. He may, in most cases he may or may not, but I don't think procedurally we should be talking friendly amendments. In our parliamentary lessons, we've learned that we shouldn't be doing that. So I'd urge the members not to ask for friendlies. Just either do it or don't do it.
Terry, can I just ask a clarifying question on this? Are you still looking to have the 200-day trip limit, or just one trip limit of 1,000 pounds?
It's a day boat fishery. I would have a maximum, just one trip limit.
And David Simpson, are you good with that modified motion? All right, Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We talked about, in our last meeting, we talked about 200 pounds versus 500 pounds, and now we've got 1,000 pounds. I was against the pounds versus pieces then, and I'm against it now. I'd rather see it be 1,000 pieces. It was changed, yeah. That's because we changed it from pounds to pieces, because you could count pieces.
You changed it to pieces.
Yeah, you're right, Eric. The current plan, as enacted last meeting, was pieces.
Yeah, well, I prefer this motion to say pieces as well. Thank you, Mr.
Terry? The issue of pounds versus pieces?
I remember that discussion. It was, my recollection is that 1 crab equals approximately 1 pound. I'm comfortable with the piece designation.
And I assume David Simpson, as the seconder, accepts that as well. Okay. All right. Yes, Ally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just wondering if instead of pieces, it should say crabs, and that was just fixed.
Fair point.
Thank you.
Do we need to caucus? No, no caucus. All right. The motion is to initiate, motion by Terry Stockwell to initiate an addendum to remove the non-trap bycatch limit from the Jonah crab FMP or increase the trip limit to 1,000 crabs. Motion by Mr. Stockwell, seconded by Mr. Simpson. All right, all those in favor, raise your right hand. Opposed? Null votes? Abstentions? Passes unanimously. Bob Beal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very quickly, is the expected timeline for this board to see a draft in February, final approval in May, and that will affect the June 1 start date of the fishery? Is that correct?
I would say so, yes. Thank you. Okay, can we circle back at this time to David Borden or the list that you worked on with staff to put it up on the board?
Tony.
For the TC. David, do you want to review it on the record?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Review so that everyone is clear here. Review the TC after this meeting and prior to the next meeting would review the Southern New England projections, develop various methods to increase egg production, examine the costs and benefits of the existing, that should be existing regulations instead of exhibition. Calculate targets and thresholds without the bubble years of 1988 through, I think 99 is the correct number, but that could be a discussion point. And based on the existing productivity or reduced productivity, develop a table of egg production by size for each LMA, examine the relationship of the inshore versus offshore stock, and describe the budget requirements for studies on the issue, and then review statements of the problem from Addendum 12 and 17 and provide recommendations on how to solve and describe the problems. And finally, characterize the 2014 existing effort by lobster conservation management area. So I would move that, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Is there a second? Pat Augustine? Any discussion? Doug?
When would you like to have this information back to the board? What's the timing?
I would hope that there would be a report at the next meeting, and that at that point the board could have a discussion with that in hand, have a discussion on how we move forward.
I have Richie White followed by Pat. Anyone else want to get in the queue? Okay, Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to expand a little bit on the comments I made earlier, and I don't disagree going forward with this. Our northern shrimp fishery is under a moratorium, and when we got science saying you should go to a moratorium, we did. That was 3 states. We're going to be in our 3rd year of a moratorium this year. It's affecting fishermen. It's affecting infrastructure. And if I was a shrimp fisherman and I was watching how this looks like it's going to progress, I'd be saying, why aren't these 2 fisheries being treated the same? So I think this is an issue that the Commission needs to look at, that if we're maybe for good reason not following the science, we need to say that, and we need to be very clear about that, because maybe since the shrimp fishery is due mostly to environmental, maybe that should be opened up and we should be fishing on that some. So I just believe that we should be very careful on how we describe what we're going to do as we go forward. Thank you.
Pat Kelleher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David, I think it's explicit in your motion as you talked about this when you originally started to list these ideas, but the intent here is to include any relationships between Gulf of Maine, Georgia's Area 1, Area 3, those type of issues would be brought forward through this process, correct?
Yeah, the answer to that is yes. You know, and the reason I say that this issue was flagged. If anyone wants to see the site, it's in the PRT report. The issue that Pat is raising, you know, this whole issue of connectivity and the relationship between the regulations in the different areas, already been flagged. It wasn't something that I developed. It was something that the PRT already recommended to the board that should be done.
Yeah, David, we have yet to accept that report, but that's coming up in another part of the agenda. Pat Augustine?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Richie White's comments, I unfortunately apologize for not having looked at any possible status of the change in the stock of northern shrimp in the last 3 years. Is there any evidence that, other than just habitat, that they moved out of the area, or is there any evidence that they're coming back in any way, shape, form, or manner? And is there any incident of incidental catch by other fishermen? I mean, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I understand your point of saying that the northern shrimp fishermen have taken it on the chin for this. And the real question is, have we seen any net result other than the economic impact? Don't need an answer, just want to put it on the record. Thank you.
Okay. Dave Simpson?
Yep, thanks. I think there are some things I'd like to know more about from the technical committee, including, as was discussed close to the beginning, a review of the work that Burton provided, which I think is extremely helpful. The projections that he did, the relationship between effort and exploitation rates. I also think it's really important for those in the industry if we could provide more insight into the relationship between our inshore stocks and our offshore stocks. I think would be really helpful, but I don't want to, we have a pretty long list there of things for the technical committee to do, and I'm not sure a lot of it is going to change a vote at the table, so I don't want to ask them to do a lot of work that isn't going to really change anyone's perspective on this in terms of whether to take action or not, kind of to Richie's point. Again, a review of what Burton did, which was extremely helpful, including the relationship, again, between effort and exploitation. That's something we've asked for years, and to me it tells a pretty discouraging story. If you want to try to reduce mortality by reducing traps, this information tells me you can't get there, and I'd like the TC to review it and give it some kind of peer review. I guess I'm also not certain what recalculate targets and threshold without the bubble years means exactly. I guess that's meant to say that productivity since 2000, what might our management objectives be based on recruitment since 2000? Is that what that means?
I think so. David, is that your intent?
Yeah, the first bullet, the review of the Southern New England projections is Burton's work. That is his work. The other point I would make while I've got the microphone is that this issue of the relationship between the inshore and the offshore stocks, this was flagged as an issue that needs further refinement as part of the Lobster assessment and the peer review of the assessment. And the logic for doing that is pretty simple. Most of the tagging studies are fairly old, and in fact the environmental conditions inshore have changed. And the question is, how has the lobster resource responded to that? The other issue is that a significant portion of the offshore area, there's very limited sampling that takes place. Most of the sampling that takes place is within 25 miles of shore. So I think we need the best and brightest minds in a room to discuss this and try to figure out a way forward. Thank you.
David Simpson, follow up.
Yeah, I think that is a good place to focus some extra study. If I were an offshore fisherman, I'd want to know how close Bob Glenn is to having it nailed that, the faucet has been shut off inshore and the flow of water to the offshore fishery, is your fate is sealed. Is that really what's going on, or is there some kind of dynamic out there that makes the offshore stock self-sustaining? So I think they really need that kind of information, because right now I think a lot of them feel like it's an inshore problem, it's not our problem. And I think we need more insight into that.
Doug, did you have your hand up? No. Mark Gibson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the motion. I might disagree with some of the elements in terms of their importance, but I won't argue about that now. The technical committee will tell us, rank these and tell us where our best bang for the buck is. I just wanted to speak a little bit to Richie White spoke about. My support or advocacy for strong reductions in fishing mortality is going to be contingent on the viability of the stock projections that we've seen so far. If the technical committee were to come forward with a conclusion that they are reliable and appropriate for management use, it would be very hard for me to ignore the projections that show that an abundance increase can take place in the face of very low fishing mortality. So I certainly haven't written that off yet, but I need to hear more about the stock projections and what the technical committee thinks about them and whether they're appropriate for us to use in management. Thanks.
Peter Burns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think these tasks are certainly a step in the right direction as we try to see our way forward here. I guess I'm just thinking about the process. So I understand that the TC would look at this and make these, do these runs and get this information for us. Would it be worthwhile in the meantime to maybe reconvene our Southern New England Working Group or perhaps the PDT to take what the TC comes forward with and be able to maybe do a preliminary assessment on what that might mean for subsequent management measures? That way it might preclude the board from having to come forward here in February now, 5 months later, and trying to pick its way through a lot of different information at the meeting.
Are you suggesting the TC work product be reviewed by the PDT and then the PDT and the TC both report at the next meeting?
If the board thinks it's appropriate, I just think it might help to focus the conversation a little bit better at the next meeting.
Well, that's probably a good idea since the PDT, some of the members are also going to be convened on Jonah crab, so maybe we could, I don't know if we overburden them or if they can discuss it all in the next 3 or 4 month period. Doug Grout.
Your PDT for Jonah crab is a little bit different than your PDT for lobster, and this is a fairly substantial list that you're asking the TC to tackle. I don't know how much time there's going to be between when the TC finishes looking at this and the February meeting. So I don't know how much time there'll be to have the PDT examine this list. The majority of your PDT members currently, that we've had in the past, are mostly technical committee members. You had been on the PDT the last time. You'd have to form a PDT to examine these. We would need to know who it is. But if it is just going to be TC members, then you're probably not going to get much different advice back from your PDT if it's a typical PDT.
So are you recommending the TC report back and then we task the PDT in the spring?
I'm not saying... I'm just worried that we won't have time to get the PDT to examine these tasks or the response from the TC. They won't have enough time to actually look at what the TC says back, because I don't think the TC is going to have a lot of wiggle room between when meeting materials are due and the next board meeting. We can do our best to do so, but it would also be good to identify who is on the PDT. If you don't have any non-TC members on the PDT, then you're just asking the TC to review the same thing twice.
Okay, appreciate that. Any other discussion? David?
Yeah, does it help, Tony, the timeline if the TC focused on number one and got a response back on that in a shorter time frame, and then the subcommittee could get together? Because to me, and it sounds like to Mark, that's the crucial thing. Are those projections usable in management? And then everything else, I think we have more time for.
That's fine. They can focus on that, do that first. They can also work on the other things simultaneously, and then we can get that to the PDT. But again, if you're PDT or TC members, then there's no reason to ask them to look at something twice.
So we got sidetracked a little bit, I think, by Pete's hope that we could convene the PDT in advance, but it sounds like we won't be able to do that. So we still need a motion. I'm sorry, we have the motion. We still need a vote on this motion. Are we ready to vote? Yes? Do we need to caucus? Peter?
Sorry to belabor the point, Mr. Chairman. I just, and like I said, I think these tasks are a good way forward, but what's the expectation, I guess, when we get this? And I understand that there's not a lot of time in between, and there's budgets and things like that, and I certainly understand that. But in doing this, is the intent at the next meeting for the board to look at this and then move forward with management measures in response?
Yeah, I would say yes. Go ahead.
Then does the motion need to express that, or is it implicit?
Tony?
I think that, you've asked for some advice back from the TC for the board to think about. The board then needs to give some direction to a plan development team on what type of management response you're looking for them. So, the document that Megan provided as an overview of how the Southern New England meeting went had a series of goals and objectives for to move forward in responding to the Southern New England stock assessment results. What we're hearing today is that we want to re-examine reference points, and so the TC is going to come back and give you some advice on that. And I think based on that advice, this board can then probably provide a goal and objective to the plan development team and some specifics on how you're looking for that goal and objective to be reached. And then the PDT can provide some advice back to the board based on the work that the TC does and the clear direction that this board gives them. I think it would be really hard for the PDT to give much substantial advice back to the board just based on what the TC comes back on, because they don't know what you're trying to achieve for the Southern New England stock. And even for the TC, they can give you responses for each of these items because David's outlined specific tasks to characterize what's going on certain aspects of the fishery or look at the inshore offshore stocks. But until you give them a goal and objective, they can't tie that back to how to go forward with a plan.
Okay, Tony, thank you. So let's vote this up or down, and then let's meet in February and create the objectives and task the PDT based on the TC's feedback. So we have the motion, shall I read it? Motion to have the technical committee examine the tasks provided today. Motion by Mr. Borden, seconded by Mr. Augustine. No further discussion. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Null votes? Passes unanimously. Did you abstain, Terry? Okay. All right. We have 10 minutes left, and we have a couple more items of business. One is the approval of the FMP review and the state compliance. Megan?
Would the board be comfortable approving the FMP review via email, since we do have other items on the agenda? I'm seeing general nodding of heads.
Bill?
Is it appropriate to put a motion on the floor at this point to approve this?
If you would like to approve it, that would be great, sure.
I'll so move if it's appropriate.
So, Bill, your motion is to approve the 2015 Lobster FMP review and state compliance reports.
That's correct.
And do we have a second? Pat Augustine. Any discussion? Yes, Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a question. I know that the de minimis status for states is part of that package of compliance, and I would want to be clear whether or not, well, I'm looking at something different from what was just said a minute ago up on the board, but before we finalize any decision here on pushing this forward, I'd like to have a moment to speak to the de minimis status issue.
Go ahead.
So I think what we're going to do is two separate motions, and we'll do one to approve the FMP review, and then we'll do one for de minimis.
Okay, thank you.
So we're going to amend the motion to strike the language about de minimis, which we've done. So the new motion is to approve the 2015 Lobster FMP review state compliance reports. The motion's by Mr. Adler and seconded by Pat Augustine. Any discussion needed on this? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Terry abstained on behalf of the council, and no null votes. Motion carries. So now we want to break out the de minimis issues.
So just to speak on that really quick, we received de minimis requests from Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia, and the current definition is that the average commercial landings have to be below 40,000 pounds. Delaware and Virginia met that de minimis request, but Maryland did not, so I'll let Maryland speak on that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, or Megan. So this isn't the first time that Maryland has had to come before this board after requesting de minimis status and being told that we have exceeded the threshold for that status. It's a concern that this issue is a concern given that we have such small landings, and it's only slightly over what the threshold of 40,000 pounds is at this current time. We have such small landings, it's such a small part of what we do in Maryland that we would be very much challenged to put together a program that would meet the compliance requirements. We have committed over the past few years to collecting information. We have a small, but hopefully it's going to become an effective at-sea sampling program that we've been working with a couple lobstermen in our state. However, we're just unable to produce the young of the year, the larval survey, the independent ventless trap surveys that would be required if we were not given the de minimis status. Now, with all of that said, since between 1995 and 2012, over the 17 years of time, we exceeded the threshold once. Since 2012, we have been hovering around 60,000 pounds. And what I'd like this board to understand is that in 2011 and 2012, we had somebody heavily invest in and participate in the lobster fishery in Maryland, and it was the reason why landings went from 10,000 pounds in 2009 to about almost 70,000 pounds in 2012. We had this, spike in harvest in our state, and we knew that this was going to be a concern given the de minimis status that we were seeking. I want to report to this board that that permit and that vessel is no longer participating in Maryland. And so what we anticipate is that as soon as this year, landings will again go back down to the point for which we probably averaged about 20,000 pounds over those 17 years prior to this individual fishing in Maryland. So I know there's not a motion on the table yet. However, when there becomes one, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to amend that motion to include Maryland. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Pat?
Yeah, to that point, this would be an exception to the rule. So is this something that would have to go before the ISFMB Policy Board as an exception, or do we, as a board, have the authority to override? I understand what you're saying, Mike. There's no question it was an anomaly by the sounds of it, and that the issue has been resolved. But I would need clarification. Would it have to move up, or could this board bypass that?
The board can grant de minimis to a state if they think it's appropriate. It's okay.
Richie?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of questions. What is the state that is in compliance with the lowest landings? In other words, how far apart is 60,000 pounds with the next nearest state? And where did the 40,000 pounds come from? What was the basis for assigning that amount?
I'm looking for help from staff.
So I currently don't have whoever the lowest landings value is for 2014 because it's confidential in that report, and I don't have access to the landings right now. But yeah, so I don't have that number for you. Sorry.
Question for Mike. Is this an Area 3 vessel that fishes exclusively in federal waters that you were describing?
Yes, it was an Area 3 that fished in both the Area 3 and Area 3 and 5 overlap. But that particular vessel is no longer participating. And so what I anticipate, what I just see is that by the time we were to try to become compliant with sampling protocols that would be required, we'd find ourselves again below the minimum 40,000 pound threshold. Thanks.
Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question for Mike, if I might.
Go ahead.
So is that vessel just out of the fishery completely, or are they landing in a different state, and may they come back to Maryland in the future?
To my understanding, that the vessel and the permit were both sold off, and it's not some right currently. It's not a participating vessel in Maryland. I don't know where it went.
Pat?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, with that follow-up information, I would suggest that the board, reviewing the circumstances that have been described and the cost that it would take to put a system in place, would, I think, would be inappropriate for the dilemma that we're faced with. And I would suggest that we approve Maryland as a de minimis state. So when you're ready for a motion, Mr. Chairman, I would so move that the 3 states that were noted, Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland, receive de minimis status for 2016.
Second from Bill Adler. Any further discussion? All right. All in favor? Raise your right hand. Raise any hand. Opposed? Abstentions? And null votes. Motion passes 10 to 1 to 1 to 0. Thank you. Okay, the last item on the agenda is under other business, and it covers the, what's that? Oh, I'm sorry, we have 2 other business. Consider approval of the Lobster Advisory Panel membership. Megan Ware.
So we are currently trying to revitalize the Lobster AP so that we can get them to have more meetings and just be more integrated in the process, especially as we move through Southern New England management. So we right now have 3 nominations for AP members. We have Grant Moore from Massachusetts, John Goodwin from New Jersey, and Earl Gwynn from Maryland. So we're looking for a motion to approve those individuals to the Lobster AP.
Bill Adler moved. Second, David Borden. Any objections to those 3 members being added? I'm assuming it's unanimous. Thank you. Now, under other business, there was a very important meeting held earlier in October that had to do with the relationship between the state and federal sea sampling program, and Megan's going to present on that.
Yes, so I was asked to just give a brief overview of what happened that meeting so people have an idea of what the status is on the Lobster Observer coverage programs. So we met October 6th in Gloucester. There are 20 attendees, including technical committee members from Maine, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. We had representatives from NOAA Garfo, New England Fishery Science Center, and then members of the Northeast Fishery Observer Program. The goal of the meeting was to understand what the actual goals are of the current observer programs, to understand what data is collected and what redundancies there are between the different programs so we can try and eliminate those. There were presentations from Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and the Federal Observer Program going over what their specific aspects of the observer programs were, and that's where we tried to find these redundancies. So there were 3 main concerns, I think, that were expressed in the meeting. The first is whether or not it's mandatory for fishermen to have observers on board. So right now for Maine and New Hampshire, it's not mandatory. For Massachusetts, it technically is mandatory, but they've never had to evoke that. And then for the federal program, it actually is mandatory. The second issue was the sampling frame of the Federal Observer Program. So right now they're only sampling from vessels that have VTRs, which is a very small portion of the lobster fishery, and it really does not capture the main fishery. So there was questions as to whether that sampling frame could be altered or increased. And then the third issue was the Federal Observer Program collects weights, so that requires extra time and extra gear, whereas a lot of the state programs do not collect weights, they just collect lengths and use a historic length-weight ratio to understand more about the fishery. So there was a question as to whether those weights really need to be measured. So some of the outcomes of the meeting are a matrix which compares all aspects of the sampling program. That's something that we are currently finalizing. Some of the states in the Federal Observer Program, they said that they might be able to develop similar codes for shell disease, egg status, molting, just to make sure that we're kind of getting on the same methods here. NOAA also said that they would look at the length-weight relationship to see how well they could predict the weights measured if they only had lengths. They also said that they would investigate application of the SBRM program with or without VTR by extricating trip-level data from individual states. So that would be addressing the sampling frame issue. And then also just getting uniform safety training and fish identification training, specifically looking at bycatch through SBRM. So that was kind of the outcome of the observer meeting.
Any questions for Megan? Yeah, Bill.
This movement into the lobster fishery, people, is troubling. I think the state, for instance, of Massachusetts is doing much of this this monitoring of stuff that the observers are trying to do, and it's a duplicate. I think there's too much duplication here. I don't know if they're looking for jobs or what. And there was one statement made to a lobsterman that he had to fill out his vessel trip report on his way in. And of course, you don't keep the vessel trip reports like on your dashboard as you're coming in the harbor, and of course you shouldn't be filling things out as you're coming in the harbor anyway. And he said, well, when I get in, I'll find out how many pounds I have. Well, no, take a guess and write it down before you reach the your dock. You know, the guy says, are these people out of their minds?
Yeah, Bill, I think this particular program, we all have some great anecdotes of how screwed up it's been. And I know that this is going to be the topic of probably the next meeting as well. We are working really hard to dovetail the two programs, and I think NIMS is showing kind of a good faith willingness to sort of meet us halfway in terms of fixing this. But I think Pat had a motion, or we want to make a comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I do have my comment is to the point that we do need to make sure that there is no delay associated with this, so I do have a motion to make. And I would move to continue, that we continue to collaborate on the state and federal level on the onboard observer program, including a discussion at the fall NRCC meeting, so that agreed upon changes can be implemented by the start of the 2016 fishing year.
Can we get a second? From David Borden, second. Discussion? You want to speak to it in any detail? No? Okay. All right. David.
Just a quick point in support of this. This actually works very well with the task list. One of the issues on the task list is for the technical people to go back and look at all the deficiency in the plan, and you know, I mean, these two issues work together.
Can we just spell out or explain NRCC? Pat, what does NRCC stand for? Tony?
It's the Northeast Regional Coordinating Council, and it's a committee of the Commission, the New England Council, the GARFO, and the Science Center, as well as the Mid-Atlantic Council. And we work on issues that cross-cut all of those groups, or at least a portion of those groups. And I think that this is looking, you know, this affects us, New England Council, GARFO, and the Science Center, and so it's a great place to make sure we get those timeframes going and the commitment to those timeframes, and we have it on the agenda.
Thank you, Pat. That's a good motion. All right. No further discussion? Can we take a vote on the motion? All in favor? Opposed? Null votes? Abstentions? Terry abstained. Thank you. All right. Is there any other business to come before this board? Yes, David Borden.
Yeah, just a quick point. Was I out of the room with Tony when you took up the PRT report, Dan? Have you taken up the PRT report?
That was the FMP review.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so just so I'm clear, so the recommendation on this issue of prioritizing enforcement in the areas where there are trap limits, that'll be forwarded to the Enforcement Committee, correct?
Certainly, yep.
Yep, thank you.
Okay, we're 10 minutes over. No other business. Bill Adler, motion to adjourn. So moved. Thank you.
We will start the hearing board in 10 minutes.